The morning mist clung to the crystal domes of celestial gardens like silk veils, and Nora Blackwood moved through the humid pathways with practiced grace. Her fingers traced the luminescent petals of azerion bloom, checking for the subtle color, changes that indicated proper mineral absorption. The research station orbited the third moon of Kepler 442b, and her work with alien flora had become both her passion and her sanctuary. She hummed softly under her breath, an old melody her grandmother used to sing as she made her way toward the restricted cultivation zone. The song had always calmed her, especially during the lonely months spent cataloging species that most humans found either terrifying or incomprehensible. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why it was while adjusting the atmospheric controls for the carnivorous twilight orchards that she first noticed them. 3 sets of silver eyes watching her from behind the massive, twisted trunks of the shadow ferns. At first, she thought they might be some sort of botanical reflection, a trick of the specialized lighting systems. But when she moved, the eyes moved too, tracking her with an intelligence that made her breath catch. Nora had been on Celestial Gardens for 18 months, long enough to know that nothing should be in the restricted zones except the carefully monitored plant life. The facility's security was legendary, designed to keep both dangerous specimens contained and unauthorized visitors out. Yet something was definitely watching her. She continued her work, pretending not to notice, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The eyes followed her every movement as she tended to the whispering moss colonies, their bioluminescent tendrils responding to her touch with gentle pulses of blue-green light. The moss had always been sensitive to emotional states, and today, its glow seemed particularly intense. When she finally worked up the courage to look directly toward the shadow ferns, 3 small heads emerged from the undergrowth. Nora's scientific training warred with pure instinct as she recognized what she was seeing. Voidling cubs, each about the size of a large dog, their sleek black fur seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their oversized ears twitched with curiosity, and their silver eyes held an intelligence that current xenobiological texts insisted was impossible in creatures so young. According to every paper she'd ever read, voidlings were apex predators with territorial instincts so strong that they attacked anything that came within 50 meters of their offspring. The adults could phase through solid matter at will, making them nearly impossible to contain or study. The cubs were supposed to be even more dangerous, their undeveloped powers making them unpredictable and prone to sudden dimensional shifts that could tear apart anything nearby. Yet these 3 were watching her tend her plants with what could only be described as fascination. Nora made a decision that would have horrified the safety protocols team. She sat down on the moss-covered ground and continued her work from there, making herself less threatening while keeping her movements slow and predictable. The whispering moss responded to her calm by creating a soft carpet of light around her, pulsing gently with her heartbeat. One of the cubs took a tentative step forward. "It's okay," she whispered, not sure if they could understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey peaceful intent. "I'm just taking care of the plants." The first cub emerged fully from the undergrowth, followed by its siblings. They moved with liquid grace, their forms seeming to blur slightly at the edges, as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When they reached the edge of the moss carpet, they stopped, heads tilted in a manner that reminded Nora of Curious Kitten's Dot. She reached for her sample collection kit, and all 3 cubs focused intently on her hands. When she withdrew a small soil analyzer, one of them made a soft trilling sound that seemed almost like a question. "This measures nutrient levels," she explained, feeling slightly foolish for talking to creatures that supposedly had the intelligence of earth wolves. The plants need specific mineral balances to survive in artificial environments. To her amazement, the cubs moved closer when she activated the device. The soft humming and the pattern of lights on its display seemed to captivate them. When she held it near a particularly vibrant cluster of star jasmine, one cub pointed with its snout toward a section where the flowers looked slightly wilted. Nora followed its indication and ran the analyzer over that area. The readings showed a significant phosphorus deficiency that she hadn't noticed yet. Her eyes widened as she looked at the cub, who seemed to be watching her reaction with interest. "You can sense the chemical imbalances," she said softly. "That's incredible." The cubs spent the next hour following her through the greenhouse sections, observing as she tended to various species. They showed particular interest in her tools and techniques, and Nora found herself explaining her work as if they were students rather than predators. Their attention never wavered, and they began anticipating her needs, positioning themselves to provide better lighting or pointing out plants that needed attention. It was when she was calibrating the hydroponic systems for the crystal vines that she realized she was being watched by something much larger. At the far end of the greenhouse, barely visible through the hanging canopy of silver leaves, was an adult voidling. The alpha parent, easily 3 times the size of the cubs and radiating the kind of presence that made the air itself seem heavier. Its eyes were the same silver as its offspring, but ancient and knowing in a way that made Nora's breath catch. Should have been terrified. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run, to call for help, to do anything except continue calmly adjusting nutrient flows, while 3 predator cubs watched with rapt attention. Instead, she felt an strange sense of peace, as if she'd stumbled into something rare and precious. The alpha made no move to approach, content to observe from a distance. When one of the cubs wandered too far from Nora's side, it made a low sound that brought the youngling back immediately. But there was no aggression in the call, no threat. It was pure parental guidance. "You're all just a family, aren't you?" Nora murmured, reaching out to gently touch the nearest cub's head. Its fur was surprisingly warm and had a texture like silk over steel. The cub leaned into her touch, and she could swear she felt a faint vibration, like the purr of some enormous cat. The other cubs moved closer, and soon she was surrounded by 3 contented predators who seemed to have decided she belonged in their world. The whispering moss beneath them glowed brighter, responding to the harmony of emotions in the space dot as the station's artificial day cycle began to dim toward evening. Nora realized she had spent nearly 6 hours in the company of creatures that were supposed to be among the most dangerous in known space. They had helped her complete more maintenance work than she usually accomplished in 2 days. Their keen senses and apparent understanding of cause and effect making them ideal assistants. "I should probably head back," she said reluctantly, beginning to pack her equipment. The cubs immediately stood, and she had the distinct impression they intended to escort her as they walked through the botanical sections toward the residential areas. Nora caught glimpses of shocked faces through observation windows. The night shift staff seemed frozen in disbelief, watching as the station's quiet botanist strolled through the corridors with 3 voidling cubs trailing behind her like devoted pets. The alpha followed at a distance, phasing through walls and barriers with effortless grace, never losing sight of its young, but never approaching close enough to seem threatening. It was protection, not predation, and Nora began to understand that everything they thought they knew about these creatures was built on fear rather than understanding. When she reached her quarters, the cubs settled outside her door, curling up together in a way that looked surprisingly domestic. The alpha took position at the corridor junction, a silent guardian that made it clear nothing would disturb the night's peace. As Nora prepared for sleep, she could hear the cub's soft breathing through her door, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone among the stars. Tomorrow would bring questions she couldn't answer and attention she didn't want. But tonight, she had discovered something beautiful, something that would change everything. Cale Thorne had been watching the security feeds for 3 days straight, and his coffee had long since gone cold. Sleep seemed impossible when every instinct he'd developed over 7 years of station security was screaming at what he was. Witnessing couldn't be real. The woman in Greenhouse Section 7 moved like poetry among the alien flora, her auburn hair catching the artificial sunlight as she worked. But it wasn't her grace that kept him glued to the monitors. It was the 3 voidling cubs that followed her everywhere, their silver eyes tracking her every gesture with devotion that bordered on worship. Cale had seen voidlings kill. He'd been part of the rescue team that recovered what was left of the survey group on Kepler 442b 2 years ago. The memory of torn metal and the otherworldly screams still haunted his dreams. These creatures were living nightmares made flesh, capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and possessing claws that could slice through titanium like paper. Yet there was Nora Blackwood, humming while she checked nutrient levels, completely unaware that she had accomplished something that every xenobiologist in the galaxy would declare impossible. Still watching the botanist? Cale spun around to find Jenna Park, his second in command, standing in the doorway with a knowing smile. He'd been so absorbed in the feeds that he hadn't heard her approach, a lapse that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "I'm monitoring a potential security threat," he replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "The containment protocols for the voidlings have clearly failed." Jenna moved to look over his shoulder at the screen, where Nora was currently explaining something to the cubs while repotting a cluster of starlight lily. One of the cubs held her water canister steady while she worked, its massive claws delicately gripping the handle. "That threat looks pretty well managed to me," Jenna observed. "When was the last time you slept, Cale?" He couldn't remember. Ever. Since Nora's impossible situation had begun, he'd found himself unable to focus on anything else. There was something about her that called to him, not just her mysterious connection with the voidlings, but the way she moved through the world, with quiet confidence, treating every living thing with gentle respect. "I need to understand what's happening," he said, pulling up the thermal imaging data. "Look at this. The cubs' body temperatures drop whenever she's near them. They're entering a state similar to hibernation, but they remain fully alert. It's as if her presence triggers some kind of deep, calm response." Jenna studied the readings with interest. Maybe they recognize something in her that we don't. Some pheromone signature, or energy pattern. Maybe. Cale switched to the biometric sensors they'd secretly placed near the greenhouse entrances. But look at her readings, too. Her stress hormones are practically non-existent when she's with them. Her heart rate actually stabilizes. Whatever's happening, it's affecting both sides. What he didn't mention to Jenna was how his own heart rate spiked every time Nora appeared on the monitors. How he'd started timing his patrol routes to catch glimpses of her working in the gardens. How her laugh, when it came through the audio feeds, made something warm unfurl in his chest that the comm system crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "Security to Greenhouse 7. We have a situation." Cale was moving before the transmission finished, his training taking over despite the confusion in his mind. He grabbed his emergency kit and headed for the transport tubes, Jenna close behind. "What kind of situation?" he asked into his comm as they descended toward the botanical levels. "The Alpha's moving," came the response from the monitoring station. "It's heading directly toward the greenhouse where the botanist is working." Cale's blood went cold. The adult voidling was nearly 3 meters tall and could phase through solid matter at will. If it had decided the cubs were in danger, Nora wouldn't stand a chance. He emerged from the transport tube at a run, his pulse pounding, as he navigated the winding paths between the cultivation domes. Through the transparent aluminum walls, he could see Nora kneeling beside a bed of singing crystals, the 3 cubs arranged around her in their usual protective formation, And there, materializing slowly through the greenhouse wall like a shadow, given substance, was the Alpha. Cale's hand moved instinctively toward his emergency tranquilizer, but he stopped when he realized what he was actually seeing. The massive voidling wasn't approaching with predatory intent. It was moving with the careful deliberation of a parent checking on their children. Nora looked up from her work and saw the Alpha for the first time in 3 days. Instead of fear, her face showed wonder and something else, recognition, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Hello, beautiful," she said softly, her voice carrying easily through the greenhouse's acoustic systems. "I've been taking good care of them." The Alpha stopped just outside her immediate workspace, its form shifting slightly between dimensions, existing in that liminal space that made voidlings so difficult to study. It looked at its cubs, who remained calm and content around Nora, then fixed its ancient silver gaze on her for a long moment. The two simply regarded each other. Cale found himself holding his breath, his hand trembling on his weapon, ready to act if the creature showed any sign of aggression. Instead, the Alpha lowered its massive head in what could only be described as a bow. Nora smiled, and Cale felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. This woman, this impossible, fearless woman, had just been acknowledged by one of the most dangerous predators in known space. "Thank you," she whispered to the Alpha, "for trusting me with them." The Alpha made a sound unlike anything in the xenobiological databases, not a growl or roar, but something musical and complex, like wind chimes made of starlight. The cubs responded with their own harmonious trills, and Nora laughed with pure delight. Cale realized he was witnessing the first peaceful communication between humans and voidlings in recorded history. And at the center of it all was a woman who treated deadly predators like beloved pets and made the impossible seem natural. The Alpha began to fade back into the dimensional space between walls, but not before fixing Cale with a look that seemed to pierce straight through him. Those silver eyes held intelligence beyond measure and something else, approval, or perhaps warning. The message was clear. This one is precious. Guard her well. After the Alpha vanished, Nora returned to her work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The cubs settled back into their usual positions, watching her hands as she adjusted growing mediums and checked root systems. But now Cale understood what he was really seeing, not just an impossible biological phenomenon, but something approaching the sacred. He stepped into the greenhouse, his boots soft on the living floor of moss and flowering ground cover, looked up at his approach, and when their eyes met, Cale felt the world shift around him. "You're the security chief," she said, her voice warm with recognition. "Cale Thorne, right? I've seen you in the dining hall." That she'd noticed him sent heat racing through his veins. "I needed to check on the situation," he managed, acutely, aware of how inadequate words seemed in the presence of what was happening here. "The situation?" Nora's eyebrows rose with amusement. "You mean my assistants?" One of the cubs looked up at Cale with those unsettling silver eyes, and he found himself being evaluated by an intelligence that felt older than the stars. After a moment, the cub made a soft sound and returned to watching Nora work, apparently deciding he was acceptable. "They're remarkable," Cale said, moving closer despite every protocol telling him to maintain distance. "I've been watching the feeds, trying to understand how this is possible." "You've been watching me," Nora said, and there was something in her tone that made his pulse quicken. Not accusation, but awareness, and perhaps something warmer. "I had to make sure you were safe," he replied honestly. "These creatures. Everything we know about them says this shouldn't be happening." Nora stood, brushing soil from her knees, and the cubs immediately adjusted their positions to maintain their protective formation around her. "Maybe everything we know is wrong," she said simply. "Maybe they're not monsters at all. Maybe they're just ... lonely. The word hit Cale harder than he expected. He thought of his own solitary existence on the station, the careful distance he maintained from the other staff, the way he'd been drawn to watching Nora, not just because of the voidlings, but because she seemed to possess something he'd lost long ago, the ability to find joy in unexpected places. "You're not afraid of them," he observed. "Should I be?" she asked, reaching out to stroke one cub's head. It leaned into her touch with obvious pleasure. "They've been nothing but gentle with me. Curious, helpful, even protective. Fear would just hurt them." Cale watched her fingers move through the cub's strange fur and found himself wondering what her touch would feel like on his skin. The thought came unbidden and left him slightly breathless. "The Alpha acknowledged you," he sighed. "I've never seen anything like it." "You were watching that closely?" Nora's smile was soft, knowing. "Were you worried about me, Cale?" The way she said his name made something warm bloom in his chest. Double quotes, he started, then stopped, unsure. How to explain the protective instincts that had been growing stronger each day, the way he'd started timing his rounds to catch glimpses of her, the dreams where silver eyes and gentle laughter intertwined. "I think I was," he admitted finally. The cubs seemed to sense the shift in emotional energy between the humans. They moved closer together, creating a small circle that encompassed both Nora and Cale, their purring becoming a harmonious rumble that seemed to encourage intimacy. "They like you," Nora said softly, stepping closer to him. "They're very good judges of character." Cale looked down at her, at the trust in her dark eyes, and the way the artificial sunlight caught the copper highlights in her hair. The cubs watched them both with what seemed like approval, and somewhere in the distance, he could swear he felt the Alpha's benevolent presence. "Nora," he began, her name feeling like prayer on his lips. But before he could say more, the comm system erupted with urgent chatter. Other stations were reporting similar phenomena, and senior staff were demanding immediate explanations for the security breach. It wasn't a breach, the containment failure that looked more like a miracle. The moment shattered, but something had been born in its place, a connection that would grow stronger with each passing day, nurtured by mystery and strengthened by the impossible family of predators who had somehow decided that love was worth protecting. Zara Quinn paced her office like a caged animal, the holographic displays surrounding her showing incident reports from 17 different stations across the sector. Each report told the same impossible story: apex predators abandoning their territorial instincts to form peaceful bonds with individual humans. And at the center of it all was her quiet botanist and the security chief, who had apparently forgotten every protocol in the manual. The weight of command had never felt heavier. As station administrator, she was responsible for the safety of 400 personnel, the integrity of cutting-edge research, and now apparently the first interspecies diplomatic crisis in human history. The Science Council was demanding answers she didn't have, and the Military Defense Corps was asking pointed questions about whether celestial gardens should be quarantined or evacuated, but watching the feeds of Nora and Cale working together. In the greenhouse, surrounded by their impossible guardians, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: envy. She'd built her career on careful decisions, calculated risks, and emotional distance. At 34, she was the youngest. Station administrator in the colonial fleet, respected for her ability to remain objective under pressure. Yet here she was, finding herself inexplicably drawn to the growing connection between two people who were either experiencing a miracle or about to cause the greatest disaster in xenobiological history. The door chimed, and Cale entered without, waiting for permission, a breach of protocol that would have resulted in disciplinary action from any other administrator. But Zara found herself oddly charmed by his urgency. "We need to talk," he said, his dark hair disheveled, and his usually pristine uniform rumpled from crawling through maintenance tunnels with Nora and the cubs. What happened today changes everything. Zara gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting how his presence seemed to fill the sterile office with something warmer. I've been reviewing the reports. 17 stations, Kale. This isn't isolated anymore. That's what I'm trying to tell you, he said, leaning forward with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Nora thinks it's connected to emotional resonance. Patterns. The voidlings aren't responding to pheromones or energy signatures. They're responding to something deeper. The way he said Nora's name, with that soft reverence, sent an unexpected pang through Zara's chest. She'd noticed the security chief before, of course. It was impossible not to notice someone who moved with such controlled power, whose rare smiles could light up a room. But she'd never allowed herself to consider him as anything more than a colleague. Now, watching him speak about the botanist with obvious affection, Zara realized she'd been lying to herself for months. Emotional resonance, she repeated, trying to focus on the professional implications rather than the way Kale's eyes lit up when he talked about Nora's theories. What exactly does that mean? She thinks they're empathic, Kale explained. Not just intelligent, emotionally intelligent. They can sense genuine caring, protective instincts, love, and they respond to it. Love, the word hung in the air. Between them, and Zara felt her carefully maintained composure waver. And what do you think, Kale? He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. I think Nora sees the universe differently than the rest of us. She doesn't categorize things as dangerous or safe, alien or familiar. She just accepts. And somehow, that acceptance created space for something beautiful to happen. Zara stood and moved to the viewport, looking out at the greenhouse domes where soft lights twinkled like earthbound stars. The military defense. Corps wants me to authorize capture protocols. They want to take the cubs for study, separate them from Nora. You can't. The words came out sharper than Kale had intended, and Zara turned to find him standing as well, his hands clenched into fists. I mean, it would destroy whatever bond is formed. And Nora would never forgive us. Us? Zara asked softly, noting how he'd automatically included himself in her decision-making process. It should have annoyed her, this assumption of partnership. Instead, it sent warmth spreading through her chest. Kale ran a hand through his hair, looking vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Zara, I need to tell you something. I'm not being objective about this situation anymore. She waited, her heart beating faster than administrative calm should allow. I'm falling for her, he said simply. For Nora, and I think she might be falling for me too. Yesterday, when we were working together in Sector 12, she touched my hand, and the cubs started that harmonic purring thing they do when they're happy. It was like they were celebrating. Zara felt something crack inside her chest, a careful wall she'd built around her emotions beginning to crumble. She'd spent so many evenings working late, telling herself she was dedicated to her career, when the truth was, she was afraid of wanting things she couldn't control. I see, she managed, proud of how steady her voice remained. The thing is, Kale continued, seemingly unaware of the effect his words were having, this isn't just about Nora and me anymore. It's about something bigger. The voidlings are teaching us that everything we thought we knew about predator behavior, about intelligence, about the barriers between species, it's all wrong. And it's beautiful, Zara. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Zara turned back to the viewport, watching as Nora emerged from Greenhouse 7 with her usual entourage. Even from this distance, she could see the easy grace with which the woman moved, the way the cubs positioned themselves around her like a living constellation of protection and devotion. She is beautiful, Zara said quietly, and realized she meant it in more ways than she was ready to examine. Yes, Cale agreed, moving to stand beside her at the window. She is. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Nora paused to examine a climbing vine that had grown across one of the walking paths. The cubs immediately arranged themselves to provide her the best lighting, their bioluminescent patches glowing softly in the artificial twilight. "What are you going to tell the defense corps?" Cale asked. Zara considered her options, weighing duty against intuition, protocol against the growing certainty that something precious was happening on her station. "I'm going to tell them that the situation requires further study before any action is taken, that removing the cubs could destabilize the entire phenomenon and result in the loss of invaluable scientific data. And if they order you to proceed anyway?" She turned to look at him, noting the way concern had etched lines around his eyes, how his shoulders carried the tension of someone prepared to fight for what mattered to him. "Then I'll have to decide whether I'm an administrator first or a human being." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a new respect mixing with the worry. "You're risking your career for this, for her, for all of you," Zara corrected, though she wasn't entirely sure that was the whole truth. "For the chance that love might be stronger than fear." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. Love wasn't a concept that typically entered administrative decisions, but watching Nora and the cubs, seeing the way Cale's entire demeanor softened when he talked about the botanist, Zara was beginning to understand that some things transcended rational analysis. "Zara," Cale said, his voice gentle in a way that made her name sound like an endearment. "Are you okay?" She realized she'd been staring at him, memorizing the way the starlight from the viewport caught the silver threads in his dark hair. The way his concern for her seemed as genuine as his feelings for Nora. It would be so easy to fall for someone like Cale Thorne, someone who protected without smothering, who could see beauty in the impossible. Too easy and too complicated, especially now. "I'm fine," she lied smoothly. "Just trying to figure out how to explain to the Science Council that our definition of intelligence might need some revision." The comm system interrupted again, this time with Nora's voice coming through clearly. "Hey, is anyone monitoring Section 12? I think one of the prismatic orchids is about to bloom, and the cubs are getting really excited about it. There. Bioluminescence is syncing with the flower's pre-bloom resonance patterns. It's absolutely gorgeous." Cale and Zara exchanged glances, both immediately understanding what this might mean. If the voidlings were responding to other forms of alien life, if their connection extended beyond just Nora, ... "I need to get down there," Cale said, already moving toward the door. "Wait." Zara's voice stopped him. "I'm coming with you." He turned back, surprise evident on his face. "Zara, if something goes wrong, if the cubs perceive you as a threat to Nora, ... then you'll protect me," she said simply, the words carrying more meaning than either of them was ready to acknowledge. "Won't you?" The look he gave her was complex, layered with professional respect, personal affection, and something else that made her breath catch. "Always," he said quietly. "Both of you." Together, they made their way through the station corridors, neither speaking about the implications of what he'd just said, or the way Zara's heart had stuttered when he'd included her in his protective instincts. The voidlings had opened doorways to impossible connections, and Zara was beginning to suspect that Nora's gift for seeing beyond the surface of things was affecting more than just alien predators. As they approached the greenhouse where soft harmonics were beginning to echo through the corridors, the sound of cubs singing in harmony with an alien flower's bloom song, Zara realized she was walking toward something that would change. Not just interspecies relations, but the careful emotional boundaries she'd spent years constructing. And for the first time in her adult life, she was curious rather than cautious about what lay ahead. Behind them, the station hummed with new, energy, as if the very walls were responding to the unprecedented harmony growing within its corridors. Love, it seemed, was indeed stronger than fear, and Celestial Gardens was about to become the center of something beautiful and transformative that would ripple across the galaxy. The cubs' singing grew louder, joined now by the prismatic orchids. Own melodic frequencies, and somewhere in that harmony, three hearts began to recognize that the impossible was just another word for miraculous.